Hey guys, hope you're doing well. I just wanted to, it's not really a hot take, but it is something a little Easter egg, if you will, that I noticed when kind of reviewing the Aetherdrift card file that I haven't seen talked about anywhere else. And I thought it'd be kind of a cool thing to share with you and your listeners. So, as you know, Aetherdrift is the first set that's being released in 2025. It's the first of six sets. We'll have three sets that are set within the Magic universe and three universes beyond sets. They're all going to be legal and standard for 5 years. And we're kicking off the year with lots of magic. Anyway, Aetherdrift introduces some cool new mechanics. One of them is called Exhaust. And what I started to pick up on when I was looking over the cards and all the stuff in the card file for the new set is that Exhaust is actually Wizards of the Coast, kind of, it's a little wink and a nod to invested and focused players because what they're telling us with this mechanic, Exhaust in Aetherdrift, the first of six sets that's going to be released this year, is that you are going to feel so exhausted by the end of the year and this deluge of new cards and crap. And ooh, anyway, I just thought that was kind of cool. Exhausting products, more Fortnite, races, Spider Man with the Buster Sword, and he's going to do something with one of the other dumb IPs. I don't know. Anyway, take care. Bye.
So let's do it. All right, cool. In that case, we can just get right on in, tuck into this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I am here as always with my co-host Anthony. Hates Cars Maddox. Don't say that's right. I saw you thinking about it. Don't say that's right.
I was thinking, I don't hate cars. I love bicycles, but I hate cars for so many reasons. I hate the impact they have on sort of like the infrastructure of cities, on the walkability of cities, the fact that, we were totally... You know what? Never mind. I'm done. Cars suck. I recognize that we live in a society where they are just unavoidable at this point. Like, I don't want to bash anybody and be like, you're making a mistake if you're buying a car, because that's how we've
pretty much
built everything. But I still would like to dream of living in a better world.
I mean, you do not own a car.
That is also true.
You're maintaining this lifestyle. I will say that there was a time I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, more like 12, 13 years ago, where I thought, wow, the future, it'll be so easy not to own a car, because this was like the early days of Uber and Lyft. And I was like, this is great. This is a great way to democratize the use of vehicles and make sure that vehicles are just in use all the time, basically. And of course,
turns out,
arguably now, I think that's probably if you put all of the ethics and morals on the scales of all of the environmental costs of owning and operating a car and all of the ethical costs of giving a bunch of money to rideshare services which are exploiting people left and right, I don't know which one comes out on top. So it feels much harder now to even imagine a world where you wouldn't need a car, given that, obviously, I mean, I was so naive 12, 13 years ago, thinking that any system of power could possibly actually just distribute resources effectively and not exploit people to within an inch of their life along the way. So, yeah.
I mean, to your point about just them not being used efficiently as a resource, it's I need a car every 3 months to, go get something large from a hardware store. And if I had a car, it would just be a big hunk of metal that would just be sitting there. And the amount of space we dedicate in our cities, in the space that humans should be living in, to just maintaining these objects. It's just we need trains. Obviously.
Mm-hmm. You're a Douglas Adams big fan, right?
Of course. And I don't think I totally understood the depth of his joke about how the aliens came to Earth and thought that the cars were the dominant race.
The dominant species.
Yeah, I mean, look at a city from a distance and it's just totally shaped by making it work for cars.
It's like an ant colony, but for cars. And then we're a little parasite that lives on the ants.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is our Aetherdrift set review episode,
Obviously.
which we have now combined and conglomerated in with our first impressions and mechanics. We're just doing one episode for the new set now, and maybe this will be our new method moving forward. We actually initially did this in the early days of the podcast, and then we had a couple 2 and 3 hour long episodes dedicated to new sets. I think the Modern Horizons one almost approached 4 hours.
Whoa.
Modern Horizons 2.
Sorry about that.
And then I was like, I am not editing these anymore. I refuse to do it. So we broke it up into multiple episodes. But now we're talking less and less about new sets because it's not what excites us about the game. So we're condensing back to one episode. But it doesn't mean that we're alone, Anthony. We do have to get our number one favorite set review companion on the episode with us. We are joined by Parker, begrudgingly owns a car, Lamascus.
Hello. I actually walk to work. I only own half a car. My partner uses it most of the time. And I don't know about the ethics of ride shares versus owning your own car, but you know what is ethical? Modifying your car and then racing it across the wasteland on your way to Valhalla. And that's what we're doing today.
You mean call time, of course, right?
No, I mean Mad Max, baby.
Yeah, we're a one-car household here with my spouse and I. I cannot imagine owning 2 cars for us. That's insane to me. One car is a little more than we need. It's nice for us to have. We have more need for a car than Anthony does. But the idea of owning 2 cars is absolutely insane to me. And that's the norm for most of, America. All of suburbia, all of rural America. Almost everybody has, a car per driving-aged adult, which is truly unhinged.
It's wild. Yesterday, I took one of the longest bus rides on a city bus service. I'm, obviously Greyhound longer, but I took a 40-minute bus ride.
On the SEPTA?
Yeah. And it was I don't know, maybe 10 miles or something. And I got out there pretty easily, only stood in the cold for a few minutes, got to where I needed to go, and got to watch Mamma Mia the musical. Great time. Live theater. Love to support it using my city bus service.
I ran 11 miles yesterday, and it took me a lot longer than 40 minutes. So far, bus is still winning. All right, well, where do we want to start? Do we want to talk about how much Anthony loves the flavor and vibes and art of this set, or do we want to dive right into the mechanics? Where do you want to go?
Yeah, let's start our engines and begin with the mechanics.
Great. I'm looking at the official article on the mothership, which I will, of course, put in the show notes. And the first mechanic here is speed and start your engines. And Parker, we've never had you on for the mechanics section. Why don't you tell us what speed and start your engines does?
Ooh, if only I had a card handy to tell me what this is.
You do exhaust then. Just get ready to do exhaust. I will do speed and start your engines. Start Your Engines is a keyword ability that basically introduces a new thing to track, and that is your current speed in the game. You have a max speed of 4, your speed starts at 1, and cards can care about your current speed. So the first card you play with Start Your Engines puts your speed at 1, and then it increases once on each of your turns when an opponent loses life. So basically, as long as you are applying the pressure to your opponent, making them lose life on your turn, you will get to max speed in 4 turns. Well, 3 turns. 4 counting the turn you started. Can you increase the turn you play it? If you have no speed, it starts at 1. It increases once each turn. Does it count as an increase on the turn that it goes from null to 1? Does anyone know?
Great question.
Happens immediately. No one can respond. Well, you know what? I can't tell immediately from reading this article, but I'm going to tell you that it probably doesn't matter that much because there's not a lot of interest in this mechanic for Cube, but this is a mechanic that basically, it reminds me a lot of Day-Night, where these cards can sort of care about the state of the game. This is a little different in that you have a speed and your opponent has a speed. It's not like a shared resource the way that Day-Night was, but it's basically a mechanic that does fundamentally encourage attacking, encourage aggression, which is the kind of mechanic we tend to really like on this show. If you refer back to our episode where we ranked the evergreen keyword abilities on creatures, all the aggressive ones pretty highly rated. Is there any reason to consider this for a cube unless you are going all in?
I mean, to me, it actually seems more familiar to the corrupted keyword, which obviously correlates with poison counters, and poison counters do more, but it was a way for them to kind of say, well, we don't want this to be only about just, a secondary life total. So let's say if you get to a certain threshold of poison counters, you'll get other effects happening. So it's sort of a motivation to uptick this counter to get some bonuses. This feels almost exactly the same. And similarly, in a lot of cubes, I'm not that interested in having an individual card, like one single card that cares about this. It is not so isolated as a lot of other mechanics that, require multiple cards to function. Like one card that cares about speed can start your engines and get you to 4 counters and start doing its thing all on its own. But because it just has this like extra element of tracking, I think a lot of cube designers are going to be a little bit disinterested in it unless they're going really all in and adding a bunch of these cards.
Right. It's not as if the mechanic has to be linear. A card like, for example, Hazaret Godseeker starts your engines and it starts you up the track, and then it also provides a means to cause your opponent to lose life every turn. So, it's a self-contained engine card, but the hoops that you have to jump through are a little more tedious to track and also slow in terms of how many turns it takes you if you only have one of those cards in your deck. And I think that's the thing that really causes that mechanic to lose its appeal for me in a singleton draft format. If I don't draw my single start my engines card until like turn 5, now it's turn 9 turn 8 at the earliest that I can get up to max speed. And combined with the fact that most start your engine cards only care about your max speed, it's a tough sell.
Hello, my name is Emma. I am, relevantly for this, an Egyptologist, and I have a hot take about Hazaret Godseeker, which is that it makes me want to cry. Hazaret is one of the coolest characters in Magic lore, in my opinion. The leader of a people liberated from Nicol Bolas, the last god of a pantheon trying to find a new purpose. And they printed a new card for her to continue her story, and I was so excited. And the second line of text reads, "Start your engines." That is, I think, it's not a good mechanic. It's not going to have staying power. It's going to be weird to track. It's going to be hard to put this in a cube on its own without a bunch of other Aetherdrift cards. The abilities aren't that good or interesting. There's really no reason to include this instead of the older, more interesting Hazaret in terms of flavor, in terms of how it plays, whatever. This is an uninteresting card that is bad. If you put it in your cube, I will cry. If you play it against me, I will probably cry for so long that I will lose the game because I will not be paying attention, because I will be too sad that this card is real.
I say we move on. We got a lot to cover this episode, so we can't dawdle on every little mechanic. Parker, are you prepared to explain exhaust to us?
Yes. So most activated abilities in Magic can be activated as many times as you want. Exhaust is an activated ability that can only be activated once. So, for example, I don't want to talk about a card that's about to be on the
the one in the article
5.
is Prowcatcher Specialist. Want me to read that one?
Sure.
The example in the article here is Prowcatcher Specialist, which is 1 in a red for a 2/1 creature, Goblin Warrior with haste, and it has exhaust, 3 in a red, put 2 +1/+1 counters on this creature. That's just a sort of simple common there, but a good example, I think, of a ability that might be a problem if you could just do it repeatedly, but this kind of gives you 2 modes. You can, in this case of this creature, play it and then level it up once, but not just sort of activate that ability indefinitely. But exhaust can appear on other card types as well, and just is applied to any activated ability that you can only do once.
A lot in this set, exhaust is used to turn vehicles permanently into creatures, which is kind of a cool little, almost kicker-esque ability. I've also heard exhaust being compared to monstrous because it's a permanent upgrade on the creature that can only be done once. Yeah, it's as vanilla as a mechanic gets in terms of flavor and kind of workhorse qualities. Not very splashy at all, right?
Yeah, I also don't love, theoretically, you could have an ability where it would be maybe hard to remember if you had actually activated it, and these don't, have any indication necessarily. I mean, in the case of Prowcatcher Specialist, it will have counters.
Yeah, I think a lot of them have counters for that reason. So
Yeah.
it's there could be other ways you get counters on things, but within this limited format, it's not going to come up that often.
Yeah, it comes down to the individual cards, but I can imagine some designs where maybe that could potentially be a little bit of an annoyance. But yeah, a pretty simple mechanic. I like that it would allow for more pushed activated abilities, but in reality, they're not really going to follow any of the heuristics that we know activated abilities to follow, because one of the sort of fundamental things about abilities like that we're used to evaluating cards for is that you can do them repeatedly. And so this is a lot more, like you said, Parker, like Kicker or Monstrous or something where you're just get a one-time upgrade on something, which, yeah, I don't know. It's modal. I like modal stuff, but none of these particular cards jumped out at me either, frankly.
It's not as if you have to play more than one of these for it to make sense or to like come across to your drafters. So
definitely not, yeah.
Just I'm thinking of it really as a tool that I can use as many as I want or as few as I want, depending on the needs of the cube.
That's kind of it for named new mechanics. I mean, obviously, vehicles is a really big theme of this set. Maybe a good opportunity just for us to take a second maybe and talk about how we each sort of approach vehicles in our cube design practice. Anthony, do you want to like maybe touch on how you think about vehicles, what sort of density you include of them, if any, and what your considerations are when you're thinking about putting a vehicle in a cube?
I like vehicles just for adding a little bit of a different texture to combat and the way you think about creature sizing in a particular cube. So in my main cube, I've got, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4. They're not something that comes up all the time, but, you know, they play into an artifact theme a little bit. They also can potentially play into themes that care about tapping your creatures or things like that. Also sort of interesting against instance or sorcery speed removal specifically, that they often, you know, are a way to sort of counter sorcery speed removal or play with wrath. So it's like, I feel like as a card type, there's a lot of interesting texture to have a couple of them. I haven't built a cube that's like really focused on them, but I guess we have inspired one in Bones' Aetherdrift.
Well, Daniel has inspired one. I don't think we can take credit.
I think he's given me credit.
For the Turbo Cube?
No. For saying on a podcast, yeah, you could build a cube entirely about vehicles, and he said, I'm going to do that.
Oh, awesome. I had no idea. Parker, what's your approach to vehicles?
Well, in my higher power cube, vehicles are really almost like another form of equipment. It's a way of temporarily getting buffs on creatures and also keeping the creature a little bit out of harm's way. So a card like Smuggler's Copter is maybe the, you know, iconic example. It's a tough card to interact with, and it provides value in combat, and it also provides a pretty strong incentive to build your deck around entering combat. And those are all things I like, especially in moderation. I like being able to recontextualize, okay, do I want, you know, my attack trigger creature to get into combat by itself, or maybe I weigh that against the value of activating my Smuggler's Copter. If I have a large creature, it might be crewing or over-crewing a vehicle because the vehicle has a line of text for evasion. So yeah, I mean, it's just contributing to this fabric and texture of interesting combat decisions that I really quite enjoy. I've also played some formats at, you know, lower power levels that are really centered around vehicles, and that can be fun too. I think especially of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, which had a strong vehicles theme. Yeah, it's fun in moderation. It's fun at a higher density as well. So I think it's just a really classic, one of Magic's classic new mechanics.
I think something else that's notable about vehicles in this specific set, though, is that all of them, I think, are colored. So whereas a lot of the vehicles we've seen in the past are just generic mana, these are going to be a little bit more focused into different parts of the color pie.
These cars have paint jobs.
Boy, do they.
And color pie philosophies. We got a greedy car and an intellectual car and an emotional car.
A car that believes in natural selection and evolution and that nature should rival all technology, but it's still a car? What?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I think your comparison to equipment is very apt for how I also think about vehicles, which is to say that absent an environment that really cares about them, which I gotta say are often not my favorite because they can kind of be a little bit feast or famine. Like if you have a bunch of vehicles and no way to crew any of them, then your cards kind of all just fall flat. And then oftentimes, because they are, I think in general, better when you're attacking because it allows you to dodge sorcery speed removal and do all that kind of stuff, it does tend to encourage this kind of attacking past each other sort of mode, at least in the few that I've played that are like vehicle-heavy environments.
So you're saying that cars lead to races?
Yes. Cars
Hey.
lead. You know when they invented the race, Anthony? As soon as they invented the second car.
There were like foot races before that. You
Nope.
know that, right?
Actually, no,
No.
there wasn't.
No.
That's not how the quote goes. I think the quote is about car racing. But whatever. Anyway, absent those kinds of environments, I, in my average deck, don't want more than... I never want to draw more than one vehicle. Let's start there. And because I never want to draw more than one, I usually don't want any more than one or maybe two in my deck lists for pretty much any deck, again, outside of environments that care specifically about vehicles or artifacts or something. So because of that, I look at vehicles in most of my cubes as a very light smattering, an opportunity for me to really choose my absolute favorite designs and choose cards that are going to be flexible and work in a lot of contexts, because they already have some inherent limitations. They only augment existing creatures. I don't want them in multiples, so I kind of treat them with a very light touch. I was shocked, frankly, when they put mounts and saddle in the same set as vehicles, because when I saw mounts and saddle, I was like, that's kind of cool. I was like, it seems like one of the downsides of that mechanic, though, is you really can't put it alongside vehicles. And then they come right along, like I said later, and they're like, here you go, we're just jamming them both in there. This is a returning mechanic, but returning from very recent history. I believe it just came out last year. Does that make sense?
Outlaws of Thunder Junction.
Yeah, so that was last year. This basically introduces the idea that you can more or less kind of crew a creature. So mounts are creatures. They have power and toughness. They can already attack and block just like normal, but you can saddle them with their saddle number by tapping any number of creatures you control with total power equal to X or more. And then that creature gains the saddled ability, and these creatures all have additional buffs or augmentations when they are saddled. So you get sort of two modes of the creature, the saddled and the non-saddled version. I feel like this mechanic works totally fine in isolation. It's actually got, because it's always going to have reminder text on all the cards that have it printed on it, except maybe for some weird commander printings of cards potentially. So I have no problem using this mechanic in isolation. I am on Caustic Bronco in my main cube and have been pretty happy with that one. I do think it's weird to include it alongside vehicles. You think they're just trying to rip that Band-Aid off, just get you used to the fact that these are kind of similar, but they are going to appear alongside each other, and even though they're kind of similar but not the same, just get over it?
I think the reasons are totally flavor driven. They're just hey, here's the set about racing. You can race cars, and sure, you can hop on a dinosaur and race that too. And I agree the fact that they are similar but sort of different is a little bit confusing, but they put it into a context where there's really only one brand new mechanic. Exhaust is not a new mechanic. They're just naming something that they do occasionally. Speed and Start Your Engines is fairly complex, but I feel like it has enough sort of narrative to hold it together, but that's really the only other mechanic that is vying for a lot of attention and understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, this set is light on new mechanics. I mean, and speed is definitely complicated, but it seems like, at least in retail limited, almost every game is going to somewhat be about it. So you'll learn it very quickly if it's a thing that, if you play the format at all. And once you learn it, I think it's probably pretty intuitive. There's another returning mechanic here, which I can see from your little call out here in the article, Parker, that even though we had not yet recorded the podcast, you did say that on the podcast you were going to talk about why cycling was a cowardly ability. So cycling's back. I don't think we have to read the cycling rules text for anybody. It's one of the most iconic mechanics in all of Magic. Parker, tell us why you believe it is cowardly to enjoy a card with cycling.
All right, so I'm rolling up my sleeves here.
Rolling up your right pant leg to talk about cycling.
I'm taking off my shirt.
Okay, good. So modality, great. I don't have an issue with modality per se. And I love having cycling as a way to kind of insulate my players from putting situational cards in their main deck. For example, a card like Wilt is 1 and a green for a disenchant effect, and it also has cycling because that's an effect that can be quite situational. I really enjoy that usage of cycling. Or another example would be as an early-late kind of mechanic where you have an expensive card, but it has a cheap cycling cost. And so if you're mana screwed, you might cycle it and dig towards other lands. I also like lands with cycling. An example would be Lonely Sandbar, where if you are mana flooded, now you can cycle your land and try and dig towards another spell. But early, you can just play the land. Okay, so these are all some common use cases of cycling that I really love.
I'm trying to figure out which ones are left.
Yeah, that sounds like most of the use cases for cycling. I will say before, the one I can think of that is left is cycling as a whole nother mode of a spell. Decree of Justice is the most iconic version of this to me, where it's do you want to make a bunch of 4/4 angels at sorcery speed, or do you want to make a bunch of 1/1 soldiers at instant speed and also draw a card? That's also a kind of use of cycling. How do you feel about that?
I'm pretty neutral. Okay. I'm also thinking of that cycle from Alara that has an 8 mana cycling cost.
The deafening cycle, I believe.
Yeah.
Or resounding cycle. That's what it is.
Resounding, I think. I'm neutral on those. No strong feelings either way. But here's where I start to lose the plot. When you combine all of those awesome uses of cycling into the quote-unquote cycling deck, that is where I start to roll my eyes a little bit, because take, for example, the cycling deck from the Ikoria limited format, or honestly, the cycling deck in the Turbo Cube, which I know is the subject of the last episode. And that's obviously an extreme, so maybe I'll start with Ikoria. In that format, there was a situation that you would find yourself in where you were just picking every card with the cycling text on it. And that's partly because the cycling costs were a single generic mana, and so it was extremely easy to draft high numbers of them and decrease the land count of your deck in accordance with that. But once you end up with like 13 cycling cards and you never plan to read the actual text of the card, and you just plan to put your cards in your graveyard and replace that draw step with another fungible piece of cardboard that you're going to cycle again and cycle again and cycle again until you hit your payoff, and then you're going to keep cycling until your payoff takes over the game by itself, that's when I start to get really bored with the cycling ability. And so that's an extreme, but my dislike for cycling kind of grows linearly up onto that extreme. In other words, I really like cycling in moderation, and as soon as people are like just blindly cycling cards to trigger some payoff, I start to get bored. I like to cast my cards.
It sounds like you don't hate cycling. It sounds like you hate Zenith Flare.
And Drakehaven.
Oh, no.
This is what it really comes down to, I think, because Parker has been railing against my beautiful new cube, Sacred Geometry, in which I include Drakehaven and a fair smattering of cycling cards and other payoffs for discarding and whatnot. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm going to sell you on this deck, Parker, because I think you chose the two most toxic examples of cycling you could possibly choose, which is Ikoria Limited, where the sort of 1-2 punch of the one generic mana cycling cards and Zenith Flare did in fact make for an extremely powerful deck that largely didn't care what its opponents were doing or what its own cards were doing, right? All the cards just said dig for Zenith Flare. I think even probably WotC at this point has been like, that was probably not quite balanced right. Maybe we should have done it a little differently. And then you send the Turbo Cube, which is obvious. I don't think I've explained why that's toxic, right? Like that is knowingly toxic. you surely agree that it's not.
Sure.
That's not, good clean Magic when you're drawing your entire deck just for fun.
But it is fun.
But what I love about these cards, for the most part, is that I think, like I said, when you were covering the individual cards with cycling, you kind of covered mostly all of the cards with cycling, right? They're either going to be modal effects in the case of Decree of Justice, they're going to be cycling on a situational card like Wilt so that you can afford to main deck otherwise sideboard cards. They're going to be cycling on really expensive cards so you can afford to put 5, 6, 7 drops in your deck and not have them just rot in your hand in the early game. They're going to be on lands like Lonely Sandbar, which have the opportunity to be lands early or just spells late, which kind of smooths everything out. That's like the vast majority of cycling cards. But what I think is really cool about including the right payoff, and we can argue separately about whether or not Drakehaven is the right payoff. I happen to think it is that it allows you to recontextualize a whole swath of otherwise individually playable cards into like something totally new and different, right? Cards that have a role in and of themselves of just being, your situational card, your removal spell with cycling on it, like the new Gallant whatever. There's a new Destroy Target Creature Power 4 greater with cycling in this set. That card works in a random deck if in the format where it's of appropriate power level, but you can also then take that card in an off-color deck and just play it if you are going to be playing to build around this heavy payoff. And I think the ability for individual payoffs to dramatically recontextualize other cards that are already flexible and modal just allows for really cool and interesting deck building.
It's a fun draft and deck build. I think the games are sometimes boring because when Drakehaven's active, not only does the game revolve around the power of that piece, but also your draw step becomes this boring, like, cycling check of, like, can I discard this card that I just drew to replace it with another card to replace itself to replace itself?
Well, I think there's two questions there. One question is, how much joy is there in creating a cool deck that maybe the sort of novelty is in the draft and deck building? And I think that's an interesting question to like ponder, because I do think that sometimes you can have a deck that plays out in a sort of rote or maybe more boring way, leads to kind of games that are not typically the kind of games you would describe as like meeting your goals, but it comes up with the frequency enough that it's the kind of thing where it's a cool accomplishment, right, for somebody to be able to draft a deck like that. The bigger question to me, though, is like, there should be counterplay, right? Like, you shouldn't be able to just say, well, now I have Drakehaven, nothing matters. I should just be making Drakes and doing nothing else with my mana. There should be ways to destroy artifacts and enchantments. There should be ways to, deal with a bunch of 2/2 flyers that are going to like mean that you still want to consider using your spells for other reasons. I don't know. I appreciate the perspective because I think cycling is a widely beloved mechanic, and so I love airing the counterpoint of it is just boring to do the same thing over and over again. And the card that has come up a lot in this conversation recently is Ret Tomb Mystic, which is from this set, right? I'm not crazy.
It is from Aetherdrift Commander.
Great, the Commander set. Ret Tomb Mystic is 1 and a blue for a 2/1 flyer, and it gives all creature cards in your hand cycling for 1 and a blue, which is a weird kind of way to use cycling, right? Because a lot of times what you want cycling for is to like find your creatures, right? Like it's the mid to late game. I want to cycle away my Lonely Sandbar so I can find a creature, or I can't cast this creature spell yet, so I want to just cycle it to find a creature I can cast. So the idea of just kind of putting this in a random deck is kind of strange on its face, because it's like, well, why would I be cycling away my creatures, which are presumably the cards I put in my deck to be good, to instead draw more random cards? It could even be a creature that I draw. And what I really, that card is in my Sacred Geometry Cube alongside Drakehaven. And what I really like about it is that it does all the things, and you get to choose at the given moment what the thing is you want to do, right? If you just want to play your creatures, then you got a 2/1 flyer for 2, and that's a thing. Maybe you do draw a creature that is like a 1-drop that's just no good anymore because it's the mid to late game, and you can just cycle it. Maybe you do draw a 7-drop that you can't cast, and you get to cycle that too. Or maybe you resolve Ret Tomb Mystic into Drakehaven, and now you can turn all of your creatures into like Elvish Visionaries that are 2/2 flyers, right? Which is basically what you get. You pay 1 and a blue. Well, I guess it still costs 3. So they turn them all into Angelic Overseers, that are 2/2s instead of 2/1s. You're paying 3 mana to cycle and draw a card and sort of make creatures. And that, that's not overpowered, right? Like, you're still paying 3 mana for a 2/2 flyer that draws a card. That's a card that's been printed basically in, Magic proper. So it's a question of like, you get this modality of how you want to use things from there on out, which I think is kind of interesting. But I do appreciate the counterpoint, Parker, and I don't disagree with your premise. I just think that there's other nuance there.
Mm-hmm. And for what it's worth, I do have a cube with Drakehaven in it, and
wait, what the heck?
I enjoy. I know, but I have done a lot of work to kind of prevent it from becoming all about cycling over and over. A lot of the ways that I prefer to trigger Drakehaven are actually just discarding a card without replacing itself.
Yeah.
So, it can be tuned. It can be a function of not just the payoffs and not just the mechanics, but also the particular designs and enablers that you choose. So obviously a flexible mechanic, and I'm not saying you should cut cycling for your cube or anything. I'm just pointing to one of the excesses of the possible excesses of the mechanic.
I'm just delighted that we're here in the Aetherdrift set review talking about Drakehaven. I think that's a great use of this time.
Have you seen the Tom Gauld comic, Parker, where it's like an illustration of a like empire, and it's got like a city and a castle and then like a bunch of soldiers and like boats, and then it's mirrored perfectly left to right.
Yes.
And one side is labeled like, our monumental city, our proud military, and then the other side is like, they're barbarous monsters. They're, it's just like this perspective change. I feel like that's you in Drakehaven. You're like, look at it in other cubes and you're like, disgusting, boring, cowardly, doing the same thing over and over again. You look at it in your cube and you're like, nuanced, great, awesome, we love it.
Yeah, why not? I'll admit to it. Just don't send me angry emails.
That's all of us, yeah. That's it for this article on the old mothership for mechanics from this set. Is there anything else in particular people want to mention before we start talking about specific cards?
No, I think it's time to dive in to our set survey. So if it's your first time joining us for a set review, I'll briefly explain what our set survey is. We ask the Cube community for every new set 2 questions. What cards are you excited about? And how would you self-rate your excitement for those cards on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most possibly excited, and 1 being, I don't really think it's going to make it, but I got to try. And so those two questions, which cards are you testing and how excited are you about them? From that, we compile the results. And I just want to say one more thing. That rating doesn't have to be about a card's power level. It could be, how good are the card's vibes? Do you think the card is stylish enough? Is it the right power level for your format? Not too powerful, not too weak. Whatever subjective metrics the respondents would like to choose, they're encouraged to do that. And so this is not really a measure of a card's power level, but a measure of its excitement within the community. For Aetherdrift, we have approximately 150 surveys from across the Cube community. That's about on par with the other standard legal releases from 2024. Duskmourn, Bloomburrow, Thunder Junction, etc. Our respondents are testing at a median 7 cards from Aetherdrift and have assigned a slightly better than average rating of 6.1 at the median. Again, very similar to other standard legal set releases. And so this is not an exceptionally well-loved set. It's not exceptionally disliked, right among the rest of the pack.
We're going to do top 5, and then I think maybe if any of us have any honorable mentions, I have a couple cards that are not top 5 that I do want to talk about, but maybe let's just start with the top 5 and then do honorable mentions afterwards. I think that's my vote.
I agree.
All right, well, I'll start with number 5. The 5th most popular card for most cubes from Aetherdrift is Diversion Unit. 1 and a blue for a 2/1 artifact creature robot with flying, and it has sacrifice this creature, counter target instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays 3. This is a kind of a callback, I think, to that Drake cycle in Urza's Legacy, or maybe it was across Urza's block, where you had the hatchling and the thing, and each sacrifice to counter by a different amount of mana. And this is, I think, a pretty cool way to put an onboard counterspell in your cube, but I think the conversation we should be having is, how fun is an onboard counterspell?
I would have guessed that you would be very on board with that because you love playing with cards, especially like the seals that are kind of an onboard effect, where the interesting part is having a little bit of information so that your opponent has an opportunity to like really actively play around it. But maybe a counterspell is just different from a removal spell in that it really can just make situations a lot less fun to try and navigate.
I like an onboard conditional counterspell. This one only counters instants and sorceries. Those are the least important components of most creature combat game plans. And so the subgame can actually be kind of fun. You can deal with this by just playing a 2/2 reach or playing a 3/3 on the ground and starting a damage race. Or you can try and get them to sacrifice the creature on an instant that doesn't matter, or you can try and sneak through a couple of instants and kind of bait out the counterspell that way. If it were just counter any spell, I would be way off this. But as it is, totally fine.
Yeah, I think it depends on how much the decks in your cube want an evasive flyer with a little bit of upside. Like, I imagine cubes that care about ninjutsu might be really into this. It's a cheap evasive creature that also has sort of late game utility. If you have a cube that cares about a lot of combos that are based on instants and sorceries, having additional answers to that without diluting threat density is kind of a nice way to have that. This card kind of satisfies that in a really nice way. But yeah, kind of I should say too, it's only being tested by 17.8% of our respondents with a rank of 6.3. So it's not, there's really one card that stands out here above the rest in this set. And this is not super popular, so right for some cubes and not for most is what it seems.
2 of the bigger trends from this survey, even relative to other standard legal sets from the last year, are that I'm not seeing much consensus about which cards are most exciting.
Good.
Again, we only have one standout. Yeah, I like what that represents. To me, it represents that people are kind of choosing their own adventure here instead of coalescing around the most powerful cards. And something else that supports that conclusion is that several constructed hits from Aetherdrift don't show up in this top 5.
Yeah, Ketramos is way down there, and that card's currently messing up many constructed formats, and that's
exactly
quite far down this list. So,
hello, my name is Emma. Relevantly for this, I am an Egyptology student, and today I have a hot take about one of the cards from Aetherdrift, Ketramos, the New Dawn. I love this card. First of all, the name Ketramos, Moza or Mose is the Egyptian word for born of. And Ketra, of course, is Oketra, the previous white god in Amonkhet who died. So Oketra Mose, born of Oketra, literally renewal of the previous god. Amazing. Also, the effect is really cool. This plays really nice with some cards from Amonkhet. It plays nicely with Embalm and with those like double-sided sorcery instant things. There are a lot of effects that can exile stuff. I can imagine a world where you like play Deathrite Shaman turn 1, and then you play this turn 2, and then you are just really off to the races. This is a very cool card. I think this is really neat.
So it seems like people are coming to Aetherdrift and picking cards like Diversion Unit that happen to fill a desired niche rather than just picking the most powerful cards.
Yeah, I think in our honorable mentions, we'll talk about a couple cards. I'm surprised to not see higher, so I agree. I think we're getting people's genuine answers for their own cube design goals, which is exactly what we want to collect in this survey. You want to take number 4, Anthony?
Sure. So number 4 is Scrounging Skyray. This is 1 and a blue for a 1/2 flying fish pirate. Whenever you discard one or more cards, put that many 1/1 counters on this creature. It also has cycling for 2. So this is this the kind of payoff that you're describing that you don't love, Parker?
Yeah, I do think this one's a little cowardly where it's like, oh, you mean my cycling payoff isn't situationally good right now? Well, I guess I'll just cycle it. I think that's super corny and like, I don't know, play with your 1/2 flying occasionally. It's not that bad. You could trigger it once and have an above rate creature.
Just you are still going to have to play with it sometimes.
In your cycling deck on turn 2, you're absolutely going to want to play this and then cycle all the rest of your Scrounging Skyrays.
Yeah, that's silly to me. Just like draw a card when it's bad sometimes and have to live with that.
I'll tell you what's silly is this guy's dumb face.
Yeah, I was going to say.
This triangular man looks like a dumpling.
It is kind of funny because if you know anything about rays, well, first of all, they don't have arms and carry swords, but also
okay, buddy. Well, let's not go down that road. Let's not go down the fantasy things and the magical cards aren't real road.
But also, if you're familiar with rays, their mouth is on the bottom, but their eyes are on the top of their head. So I think that we're actually looking sort of at its nostrils or something.
Yeah.
All the better to scrounge with, I guess, to have your eyes on the other side of your head.
This is the kind of cycling card that doesn't excite me either, to be honest, Parker. Honestly, because it just doesn't... I'm not excited about either side of this in any circumstance, right? Like, at least a relatively boring removal spell like the new Gallant whatever. I'll put it in the cards mentioned page, even though I can't remember the name of it now. At least that sometimes is great. You're like, oh, awesome. My opponent has a huge monster. Now I get to destroy it with this removal spell. That's a cool swing. This is just kind of fine either way, which does not really excite me.
This is tested by almost 20% of our respondents with an average rank of 6.2. Our third most popular card from Aetherdrift is Greasewrench Goblin. Costs a single red mana for a creature, Goblin Artificer. It's a 2/1, and it has the exhaust ability for 2 and a red. Discard up to 2 cards, then draw that many cards. Put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And as a reminder, activate each exhaust ability only once. It's tested by almost 30% of our respondents with an average rank of 6.7. So we've got a Jackal Pup, it's got a relevant creature type line, and it's also got this late game modality where you get a little bit of card selection and you upgrade your Jackal Pup into a 3/2. It's neat, it's very nuts and bolts, no pun intended. Yeah, just a classic Lucky Paper Survey top 3 card where it's obviously powerful and obviously an upgrade on a well-known staple.
Yeah, I agree. This is definitely filling that role of this is similar enough to cards that people have played with for years in Cube that they are pretty confident that they are going to want this if they know they want it. I think in this particular case, too, the threat of activation will be very real. Once you're on turn 3 or later or have 3 mana up, then your opponent has to be willing to lose any 3 toughness blocker they throw in front of this, so they don't just get to free block your Savannah line later on. And discarding up to 2 cards and drawing more cards in the late game can be really strong. So I see the appeal of this for sure.
I kind of like that threat of activation. It's almost like evasion, but without having an actual evasive keyword on it. That's kind of neat.
Yeah, threat of activation is... I love when it plays that role, where it's like, it's not actually evasion. I'm just giving you the choice, and you get to make the choice, and then I get to make other choices based on your choice. It's like we're playing a game. I love it. That brings us to the second most popular card from Aetherdrift for most cubes, and it's kind of similar to a card we've already seen. It's Marauding Mako. 1 red for a creature shark pirate. It is a 1/1. When you discard 1 or more cards, put that many +1/+1 counters on this creature, and it has cycling 2. Would you even call this a little cycle of cycling cards here? These 2 cards, are there similar ones in other colors, or is it just the red and blue ones here that are so similar? Marauding Mako and Scrounging Skyray got a lot in common.
Yeah, I mean, just for 1 less mana, you lose flying and a point of power. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think this really stands out as anything different. To my taste, I like having evasion on a creature that, like, takes some work to grow it over time and, like, building a really synergistic deck around it. So even though this is cheaper, I'm less excited about this. I guess also this is, I was sort of thinking, like, I was surprised to see this so high because it does scream as, like, put me in your cube that's all about cycling kind of deck, but increasingly, we just have so many creatures like Inti comes to mind that are just constantly like digging through your deck that this might be something that even if you just put this in like a pretty high-powered cube, there might already be so many ways to trigger that it just becomes a really powerful 1-drop.
I was honestly thinking that, like, I imagine some people are playing this in a cube expecting to, like, make it a combo card with Wheel of Fortune.
Sure,
and just,
right,
you know, put it in a deck with their Shoulder the Apocalypse and their, like, sort of wheel combo deck, and now they have an enormous creature to pay off for it, too, which it's in the colors for that, which kind of interesting. This one's a lot more popular than Scrounging Skyray, being tested by 29.5% of our respondents with an overall rating of 6.9, which is the highest rating of any card in the set. Oh no, there's one little weird guy here that's an outlier.
The highest rated popular card.
Yeah, I don't know how much else to say about this. We talked about the 2 mana one. I think the 1 mana one is substantially more powerful because it costs 1 mana less, and that's 50% less mana. That's pretty good. And I think also the color shift is probably another important factor here. I think more people are likely to have discard themes in red than maybe blue. So yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about this as like a generic aggro threat if you just have enough inties and Fable the Mirror Breakers that this is like good enough. But I can see how this sort of clean design fits into a lot of different cubes. Still not my favorite kind of payoff for the cycling deck personally, or my favorite kind of card recycling.
Yeah, agreed.
And that brings us to our number 1 card, Grim Bauble. This is 1 black mana for an artifact. When it enters, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-2 until end of turn. And it also has 3 mana, so 2 and a black for tap, sacrifices artifact, and surveil 2. This is being tested by many, many more people, a full 40% of the people that respond to the survey, with a pretty high ranking of 6.8 out of 10.
This is the only card that I would describe as having any kind of widespread popularity in the cube community, from Aetherdrift, that is. And I gotta say, I couldn't imagine a less exciting number 1 card.
Oh, shut your dirty mouth. This card is so exciting. I'm obsessed with it.
It just seems so meat and potatoes to me of like, I mean, yes.
Oh, now we hate meat and potatoes too? What are you going to hate next, Parker?
Fried chicken?
I don't know. Yeah.
Chocolate?
I don't know. Like, why is it just a sorcery disfigure that surveils 2 for 3 mana? Are you kidding? That's the most, like, overplay tested set of numbers on this card. It's really weird to me. And then it's just a bobblehead.
Okay,
and like,
we'll come back to that. Let me talk about everything I love about this card first. So we're going to come back to the fact that it's a bobblehead.
Okay. What kind of bobblehead?
It's a bobblehead.
Mm-hmm.
So I have wanted a disfigure ++ or a deadweight ++ for years. We don't spend a lot of time in this podcast talking about cards we wish Wizards of the Coast would print, because what's the point? There's no point in doing that. But I've always felt that, like, you've got your shock variants, right? You know, 1 red mana to deal 2 damage, usually to any target, and usually with some other kinds of upside, right? How many times have we gotten Galvanic Blast or like one of these sort of shocks with upside over the years? Unholy Heat. There's so many of them. And yet in black, we have Disfigure and
Stab.
Stab, which is the same as Disfigure. Like, it feels like there's so much unexplored space for creature to get -2/-2 with some upside attached to it. And this is a sort of kind of space that I am really excited about. I think in most cubes, the fact that this is an artifact is going to be pure upside, basically. You know, it doesn't matter if your opponent can destroy it. They're never going to bother destroying it. I mean, even if you could... If you get to the point of the game where they're worried about you sacrificing it to Surveil 2, then you have other problems to worry about, and they're not going to bother destroying your Grim Bauble. So it's not a weakness that this thing has an artifact as a type line. It does mean you can recur it with things like Emery, and there's all kinds of artifact recursion themes we've seen in a lot of different cubes. That's part of the role this is going to be playing in my main Sacred Geometry cube. But most of what I love about this, Parker, is just that it is an early game removal spell. You know, I'm playing against aggro. I'm on a blue-black control deck. I remove their 1-drop with my Grim Bauble, and then I hold up my counter spells, I hold up removal spells, and later on I get a little bit of value. This is a little better than just playing Disfigure in my deck, which also means that when I draw it late game and there's nothing left to Disfigure, it's expensive, but I still have 4 mana of Surveil 2, and I could do 3 mana of that at instant speed, which just gives us so much more play and so much more flexibility. And I love Disfigure, right? My cube has Disfigure, it has Deadweight, it has Ulcerate, it has all kinds of cards that are in that space, but we have so few of them in black compared to similar sort of exploration in red, and so I'm really excited to see a Disfigure or a Deadweight with some upside here that I think I'm glad to see this higher on the survey too. I think it's going to play a really strong role, a nice bread and butter role, like you said, a nice meat and potatoes role in a lot of different cubes, and I love the design of the card mechanically. I think it's kind of brilliant.
All right, I like Disfigure. I mean, you've got me there.
Cleaner.
And
Disfigure's cleaner, no doubt. And I'm never cutting Disfigure from either of these cubes either. But I'm glad we got more in this space, and I'm honestly glad for what it means for perhaps the future of more cards in this space. Right? Like another example of a card that I've always wished there was a reasonable way to print, but there just kind of isn't. Is we get a lot of divided damage red burn spells, but it's really inelegant to divide -X over multiple creatures. There are ways you can do it. Wretched Confluence is a way that kind of does it. There's even that Contagion, that card that distributes -1/-1 counters and then picks them up at the end of the turn if they're still there.
It's -2/-1 counters.
Yeah, it's something crazy. So there's ways that they can do it, but it's not anywhere near as elegant as just writing, you know, the rules text on Arc Lightning or Chandra's Pyrohelix. So that's another sort of space where these black toughness-based removal spells, and I love toughness-based removal, especially really efficient toughness-based removal, where they just tend to suffer in terms of their variety and diversity. So I'm just like over the moon to see a version of that on this card. Now it is a bobblehead.
It is a bobblehead,
and but it's not spelled bobblehead. It's Grim Bauble, like a brooch or a locket or something, and then the art is a bobblehead, and so you have to go through a pun to get here.
Dashboard. Look, Anthony, you've been very vocal about really strongly disliking the flavor from this set. And I would be on record.
I think I've been keeping it pretty chill.
You haven't been. I'm here to tell you. I want it on record that like I actually don't share most of your like overall like vibes based. I think the set's fine. Like I think there are cards that I like aesthetically, cards that I don't like aesthetically. I don't think it's any meaningfully different than Kaladesh or, you know, plenty of sets that are well in the past now in terms of like, you know, your changing relationship with the game. I honestly, you know, this is not the place to unpack it, but I think you have a lot of details and sort of nuance surrounding your changing relationship with the game. And I think sometimes the newest set just becomes the subject of your ire, whether it's, you know, fair or not that this set is actually that different. Who knows? Doesn't matter. It's how you feel. That's what matters. That's valid. I, generally speaking, though, I think this set's fine. I'm not as bothered by the aesthetics as perhaps you are. But it really stings that my favorite card mechanically from this set is probably my least favorite aesthetically of all of them. And I was thinking a lot about this because, you know, we have cards like Urza's Glasses, which I think are cool. Like, I like Urza's Glasses. That's a cool card. I don't mind that we have a card that's just like referring to like a dumb, trivial object that like sits on a desk. Bobbleheads are the worst. In real life, bobbleheads suck. Can you think of a more, if they're like the Funko Pops, can you think of a more vapid, shallow, meaningless, like piece of garbage that is just going to eventually be floating around the Pacific Ocean because it serves no function to society? It is so dumb. I hate bobbleheads. And so the fact that this is sort of a play on, not glasses. Glasses are cool. Glasses allow people to see. Glasses are technology. That's cool. Urza's Glasses is cool for that reason. This being a bobblehead is just truly, it's mildly devastating to me. I think it sucks so bad. And I'll be honest, when I first saw the card, I was so excited. I saw the skull. I read the rules text. I was like, this card is awesome. It's so perfect. And then as my sort of eyes came into focus and I noticed the dashboard of the vehicle this thing is on, which it's it's a huge bummer, but it's not going to stop me from playing the card, but it is going to make me a little salty every time I do. And I really hope we get, I in general am also like, I just don't care about any of the like designed to be collectible treatments of cards, but please give me a secret layer, give me anything where this is just drawn like a normal Bauble, Bauble, normal artifact instead of, it's even got a cool name. Grim Bauble is a really cool name.
Maybe it isn't a bobblehead. Maybe the Grim Bauble is just the skull which somebody has stuck onto a bobblehead.
Maybe.
Yeah,
Anthony.
maybe.
Or maybe that's actually just a creature. That's a little guy.
And he's dead. Because the skull weighs so much, it gives him -2/-2 and crushes his little brain.
That makes sense, actually, yeah.
So yeah, look, that's my little rant about this. Bobbleheads. It's like what's next? Like promotional pen, a new artifact equipment that
Foam finger.
Yeah, like
creepy lanyard.
Even foam fingers are cooler than bobbleheads. Foam fingers are kind of cool. They're weird.
There is a Mad Max cube in my play group. This is possibly the most stylish cube I've ever seen. It is stored in a green ammo container, unsleeved.
Is that just all the cubes in your play group?
No, this one is especially stylish. The way you shuffle it is by shaking the ammo container.
Oh my.
These unsleeved cards.
Beautiful.
And then you just open it up, dump them on the table, make packs.
Is there a video of this somewhere? I need to link to this from my shuffling article.
I will ask the creator, Dan, and see what he can dig up. But then you draft your basic lands, and you draft exactly 40 cards, and you skip deck building.
Perfect. I love it.
And then you just play Mad Max cards.
Awesome. Sounds sick.
So, my bobblehead would never fit in one of my cubes, but this bobblehead will be perfect in that cube, and I'm so excited to play Mad Max again.
Hey, it's me, beloved, unwilling participant in the coining of the phrase clown shoes cube. Gay trans mole drifter. I'm going to spare you all a ramble about how this is like another tropey reference core garbage set, because frankly, I think we've all heard it at this point. Instead, I'm going to talk about two cards that filled me with a profound sense of ennui. The first one is this card called Howl Squad Heavy. It's like Goblin Rabble Master if he had none of the swag and got no bitches and stacked 0 paper. I don't know, there's something very depressing to me about the fact that they just keep making Goblin Rabble Master. Isn't that kind of sad to just come out and say, this is the best we've got for red free drops, folks. It peaked 10 years ago, or however the hell long it's been since they made Goblin Rabble Master. It's Goblin Rabble Master variants until we're all dead in the grave. Very sad. I would also like to talk about the card Ovia Automech Artisan. Okay, so the card Elvish Piper? You know how when you were 14 years old, you thought that the card Elvish Piper was really cool? You were actually a dumb idiot when you thought that. You actually needed a card that has a line of multiplayer text on it that reads like a logic puzzle, and also it needed to pay off your cards. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Should we move on to some honorable mentions, cards that we care to talk about that may not have been in the top 5 of the survey?
Yeah, let's do. One of the cards that I'm actually most excited about for my powerful Eternal Cube is Brightglass Gearhulk.
Yeah.
This is way down in the 15% of respondents testing it, but it is green, white for a 4/4 artifact creature construct. It has first strike and trample, and when this creature enters, you may search your library for up to 2 artifact, creature, and or enchantment cards with mana value 1 or less, reveal them, put them in your hand, shuffle. It's kind of like Ranger of Eos, which is a card I love, but is from a very, 2008-ish power level. This Gearhulk is a lot harder to cast, but a lot more flexible. You could get an Urza's Saga with this. You could get an Urza's Saga and a portable hole. They don't have to be creatures, but you could also just go with the level 1 route of getting Mother of Runes and Llanowar Elves, or whatever the 2 best creatures in your deck are. Hex Drinker maybe is a better example. And I love cards like that you can read it and it's an awesome card and you understand how to deck build with it on level 1. And then you don't have to be an expert to enjoy that and for it to be good. But then on levels 2 and 3, when you're getting non-creature artifacts or you're getting an enchantment land, it makes you feel like a genius, and it's still unlocking really cool deck building and gameplay patterns. I think it's awesome.
I also really like this card. It's one of the ones I'm excited about for the Bun Magic Cube. I love these kinds of like narrow toolboxy cards where you can build a tutor package that you get to choose in the draft portion what you care to pick up with this, right? You can get a Walking Ballista, you can get an Urza Saga, as you mentioned, you can get whatever pieces you want, and this covers a really interesting array of the options when you do have things like Portable Hole in your cube. So yeah, I'm really into this card. You know, the full 4 color casting cost with no generic pips is definitely a high bar, but I'm into it. I'm definitely excited to try it. And it's a respectable creature on its own, too. I mean, a first strike trample 4/4 is going to be a problem for a lot of decks on a lot of boards. So you're going to get the ETB value. It's going to essentially draw 2 cards. It's a really good mull drifter. It's going to draw 2 cards, then if they don't answer it, it's also going to beat their face in. So I think this card's very cool, too. I agree, Parker. It's one of the ones I want to talk about.
And even if you cast it late, because of that pretty intense casting cost, you can always just grab a colorless artifact and play it with your 5th mana for the turn, the one that didn't happen to, help cast the Gearhulk. So it's still good behind curve. Back in like 2018, when the discourse was like, what's the best in slot for Selesnya? It doesn't have anything interesting or whatever. If only those people could see this Gearhulk now, their eyes would be popping out of their skulls.
Yeah, I don't care what happens to the eyes of best in slot people.
Fair enough.
One of the cards I want to talk about is Cryptcaller Chariot. This is 3 and a black for a artifact vehicle. It's a 5/5 with menace, and it has crew 2. And whenever you discard 1 or more cards, create that many tapped 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. I think this is a very cool card, and there's actually a little sort of pattern here, or a cycle, whatever you want to call it, of vehicles that make the creatures that crew themselves, but after you jump through a hoop or two. Like, they don't make them on ETB. They don't make them all the time. There's also that Thopter guy that does when you draw a second card each turn. Again, all cards will be on the cards mentioned page, but this one's cool because at its base rate, it's just a 4-mana 5/5 vehicle with crew 2, which is, not great. Like, that could be maybe even a common, or definitely an uncommon in an average retail set. But it also has this kind of crazy line of text. It's discard 1 or more, you make that many. So it's like you cast a Wheel of Fortune, you're making however many cards you have in your hand, that many zombie tokens. It's not a trigger that happens whenever you discard 1 or more. It's, that many. So a really awesome payoff, I think, for discard decks. It uses a iconic, very common token, which is very cool. It's going to, I think, play kind of like an Asika's Chariot, but it requires some building around. It has a much higher ceiling and a lower floor. And if you're worried about it, being susceptible to removal, you never have to turn into a creature. You can just leave it there as a sort of value-generating artifact that just sits around. Or in the right game state, you can just start crewing it and start bashing face with the vehicle itself. It's a really cool one. I don't think it slots into any of my own personal cubes at this exact moment, but it definitely stood out at me as a kind of a sick card that is not quite like anything we've seen before.
I mean, it's kind of like Drakehaven, but you don't have to pay the 1, and also gives you the bonus of also this 5/5 vehicle.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I will say I know why they did it. I never like making tapped creature tokens.
Is it just tap so you don't just like play this on, with 5 mana and your opponent just doesn't know if you have a way to discard and crew it immediately? Is it just that?
Well, I mean, you can still discard instant speed. Like, that's not out of the question.
Or I guess just like
it would also have
always having surprise blockers forever for the rest of the turn would not, or for the rest of the game would not be.
I think that's more of it. Yeah, it's just that one's very cool to me. Do you have anything you want to talk about, Anthony, that excites you from this set?
Nope.
Okay, great. Moving on. Parker, what's your next card you're excited to talk about?
My next card is Sundial Dawn Tyrant. This is 1 and a white for a legendary artifact creature construct, and it's a 3/3. Vanilla. No other text. No other rules text. And this is actually part of a cycle with 4 other vanilla legendaries, but this one's my favorite. And it's because we have a 2-mana 3/3. This is the card Watchwolf, was the first of its kind, and Watchwolf was a multicolor card. This one only costs 1 color, and the downside is instead being legendary. You can't put 2 of them onto the battlefield. And so...
And an artifact.
Right. And that's another upside, which I also love.
And downside. It's both.
Oh, you're counting that as a downside?
I think it's definitely part of the downside of the card is that it's got an additional type line, susceptible additional removal, but it's a downside you can turn into an upside.
That's a great point. So I love how this card is able to do something that feels really fresh in the like power toughness versus mana cost world, where it's like a really unique casting cost. It's clean and appealing. And then it also has these next level things of like, it might trigger your Yoshimaru, or it might trigger your, I don't know.
Traxos.
Yeah, exactly. So it's got all of these kind of next level and emergent synergies on top of what is already so clean and so just kind of viscerally appealing of a 2-mana 3/3. I want to play this in my high power cube, despite knowing that it's probably not there on power level. And so instead I'm looking at other cubes that I have and I'm like, maybe I can just squish it in there and make it fit, even if it doesn't. And to me, that's a sign of a really cool design.
I mean, this is a vanilla creature that is the 9th most popular card in the entire set from all of our cube respondents in 2025, which I think is awesome.
That is pretty wild.
Mm-hmm.
I also really like this card in my Sacred Geometry cube, which is my broader power level band cube where I really care about the elegance of the cards included. I used to have Watchwolf. I feel like it's kind of iconic as like, at least I think of it as like the eponymous 2-mana 3/3. But I definitely swapped it out for this when this came along, and I think this is just better in every way, right? Like, I don't think that even in that cube, which is lower power level, that you need to have a 3/3 at 2 mana be a gold card for it to be balanced. I think this is totally fine. The sort of complexity hidden in this type line is the perfect kind of complexity for me, in that a lot of decks don't have to care about it, and it has no rules text, so you just play it as a 2-mana 3/3 and you're fine. But as soon as you have cards that care about artifacts in your deck, you can start looking at that type line and turning that otherwise usually meaningless piece of text into something that matters for you. It's like this, it's the perfect sort of emerging complexity that you can care about if you care about it, and if not, if you're a less enfranchised player that isn't drafting the artifact deck, that is no additional complexity for you to read to evaluate that card in a pack. You just won't even look at it. I think that's a great way to get some more sort of synergy and complexity into a cube where you're trying to be conscious of how that impacts players and drafters.
Yeah, so cool.
I want to talk briefly just about Agonasaur Rex, because I saw a couple people talking about how this was like an example of like the most pushed thing, and isn't it crazy that all these cards are so pushed these days and broken. I'll read this real quick. It's 3 green for a creature dinosaur. It's an 8/8 with trample. It has cycling 2 and a green. When you cycle this card, put 2+1/+1 counters onto one target creature or vehicle. It gains trample and indestructible until end of turn. So this is a 5-mana 8/8 trample with upside. The upside being that you can also use it as a uncounterable combat trick by cycling it and drawing a card, and also doing some stuff in combat.
I mean, and a really good combat trick. Like, 3 mana is not where you usually want to be for a combat trick, but the fact that it gives your creature indestructible, so it's always going to work in terms of saving your creature and drawing you a card.
That's not good. There's exile, there's balance, there's plenty of ways that
it'll always work.
It's not as good as hexproof.
It's true, but like that's still a very good protection spell, and then stapled to, oh well, if you go all the way up to only 5 mana, like I expected to see that kind of effect, and then see a like really overcosted thing as kind of the fail case, but no, it just costs 5.
I think this is totally fine. I don't think this is actually that pushed. I think this is what 5-mana creatures should do in 2025 when you have removal. Honestly, I think it is very similar to Verdurous Gearhulk, which is already a 5-mana 8/8 trample. We've had that for many, many, many years. That one has a different upside of, it's not modal, you have to just cast it, but when you cast it, you can either have your 8/8 trample, or you can, more often than not, spread that power and toughness around the rest of your board somehow, which, I don't know. I guess card is definitely very, really strong, but it does not stand out to me as like any better than any other 5-drop we've gotten in any set in recent history. It's like, it's a different way to make a powerful 5-drop, and whoop-de-doo.
The combat trick mode does everything you want a combat trick to do. Makes your creature bigger and gives it trample so you can push damage. Makes it indestructible so you can counter some removal spells with it. And it draws a card, it replaces itself.
And it draws a card even if they remove the target, because it's cycling.
That's
it's
true.
Not a like actual spell.
Yeah. I think that's a lot. And yet, the thing that prevents combat tricks from showing up in Pioneer and even standard constructed formats, or cubes that sometimes take their cues from constructed formats, is that removal is plentiful and cheap. And so if you proactively use your combat trick, it will just get removed in response and your spell will fizzle. This one insulates you from that by having you draw a card, but it isn't like 3 mana draw a card is not exactly where you want to be. And so, yes, I agree. It's very finely balanced and kind of tuned to insulate you from a lot of the risks of usual combat tricks, but it's still not incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and also, like, you know, people are going to talk about how broken a 5-mana 8/8 is. It's like, all right, well, why are you discarding it for a combat trick, right? Like, and you will do that a lot, I think, because I think these modes are probably pretty competitively costed with each other. So, well, I guess what we're saying, Anthony, this is the perfect card for the regular cube. You love combat tricks. You love +1/+1 counters. Targets your own creature.
You're right.
Hello, everybody. My name is Trainmaster GT, and this is my hot take. I think the coolest card in Aetherdrift is Agonasaur Rex. It's an interesting modal card in the fact that you can cycle it for 2 and a green to put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature or vehicle, and giving that card Trampler indestructible until end of turn. But it's also just an 8/8 with Trample for 3 and 2 green. I love this card because it is so honest about what it is. As Usman pointed out to me when we did our set review podcast, this isn't the first card that puts 8 power on the board for 5 mana. We've gotten multiple cards that do that in the past. Colonian Hydra, for example, basically becomes an 8/8 the first time you attack with it. We also had Verdurous Gearhulk from Kaladesh, which lets you distribute 4 +1/+1 counters among your team, while also just having a base stat of 4/4. Even Wolfear Silverheart from all the way back in Avacyn Restored could actually put 12 power and toughness on the board for 5 mana, as long as it was paired with something else. The thing is, all of these cards kind of obscure the fact that they put so much power and toughness on the board. Sure, your Verdurous Gearhulk technically adds 8 power and toughness to your board, but it doesn't say it. It just looks like a 4/4 with an enters battlefield effect. Agonasaur Rex, however, is just honest about what it is. It's an 8/8 trample for 5. I think cards that clearly communicate what they do tend to be very nice to have. And I think this card clearly communicating the fact that if you play it as a creature, it is going to be a big guy is just really nice. Thanks for listening.
I want to talk about a little sort of maybe unsuspecting uncommon here in Shefet Archfiend. This is 7 mana, 5 black for a creature demon. It is a 5/5 flyer. When it enters, all other creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn, and it has cycling for 2 generic mana. I think this is a cool example of a cycling card. This fits perfectly in my Sacred Geometry cube, where I not only have a sort of cycling theme and a discard theme, and also prize cards for their sort of elegance. It has cool art, but also, like, it's an iconic creature type. I want to get a certain number of, like, dragons and demons and angels into the Sacred Geometry cube. It just feels right to me. And I think this actually has play probably at a couple different power levels. I like it just as, like, a control deck has a 7 mana finisher that you can cycle early if you need to. But if you're playing reanimation spells, this also looks pretty okay as a way to just discard itself and then have a, like, board wipe on a decent sized stick that comes into play. It's obviously not going to compete with, you know, reanimating the best of the best targets like Atraxa or Grizzlebrand or whatever. I guess it's not Grizzlebrand anymore. It's 2025 Atraxa or the Modern Horizons Archon of Cruelty. That one. But at a slightly lower power level, I think this has a lot of cool play to it. Do you like this art, Anthony? I think this art's cool.
Yeah, this one's pretty cool.
It has, like, old school Magic vibes to me, this art.
I agree.
It does. It's very cool art. The other thing I like about this as a reanimation threat from a design perspective is that it gives you most of your value up front. Having an infest stapled to this creature is often helpful for a reanimation deck where, like, it kind of alleviates some pressure, and then it lets the 5/5 flying get to work. But the 5/5 flyer is not going to kill you very quickly, and so it actually provides a little bit of counterplay naturally just because it's a slow clock. Most of the snowballing happens initially, and then it travels pretty slowly after that to get across the finish line. Contrasting to a card like Grizzlebrand that snowballs exponentially if it stays in play for 1 turn. So it's actually kind of a neat play pattern. I would be, if I had a reanimate deck that was interested in this, I would certainly test it out just for that play pattern to see how much fun it was.
And per like the previous conversation on Agonasaur Rex, it makes sense at uncommon you would cost this way, so it wasn't just, a huge crazy bomb and limited. But I think this could easily be a 7/7 or an 8/8 flyer at the exact same cost and be completely reasonable in constructed magic or sort of rare magic. The fact that it's a 5/5 makes sense given that it's uncommon. But I think it's just cool to have a big demon. Parker, got anything else you want to talk about that excites you?
I don't have any other individual cards. I do want to just mention we have not talked about start your engines or mounts. And from a holistic perspective, those were very much looked over or ignored by our survey respondents. I did not see any start your engines among cards tested by a significant number of respondents at all, which is surprising to me for a headline mechanic, but also per our earlier discussion on start your engines, I can see why it might not be so popular. Saddles, I think there's one or two examples among the cards tested by a significant number of respondents, but again, not very popular.
There's one last card I want to talk about, really only as a sort of case study in cube design, which is the Aetherspark. This is that new legendary artifact planeswalker equipment. I did not have this on my bingo card, that we would be getting a legendary artifact planeswalker equipment in the set about racing. I'll do my best to read this rules text, but you're probably going to read it yourself if you actually want to follow along. It's 4 generic mana for a planeswalker with 4 loyalty. As long as it is attached to a creature, it can't be attacked and has whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage during your turn, put that many loyalty counters on the Aetherspark. It upticks by 1 to attach the Aetherspark to up to 1 target creature you control, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. Downticks by 5 to draw 2 cards, and downticks by 10 to add 10 mana in any one color. Do they have to make that one color? Could they make it any? Is that a balance thing? Was it too good if it made 10 mana in any combination of colors?
Great question. It might also just be make tracking much, much simpler. Like if you're like, I'd make 10 mana, it's like, oh, okay, well, let me pick 2 of these, 2 of these, 2 of these. Sure. It could just be kind of a mess.
This card has got a lot going on. It's a lot of stuff kind of combined in ways that we've never seen before. We've never seen an equipment planeswalker. We've never seen an artifact planeswalker. I mean, you might think that Karn is, but Karn is not. Karn is just a planeswalker that happens to be made of silver. Don't ask questions. This is not the time for questions.
There wasn't room on the type line.
So the first time I've seen an artifact planeswalker as well. The first time we've seen a planeswalker that can attach itself to other permanents.
It's also maybe the first planeswalker that doesn't have a planeswalker type. Again, that is probably just related to the type line.
Oh, you mean yeah, you're right, because there's the planeswalker types that used to be like a legendary thing where you were like type Jace. That's true. It doesn't have that either. I just want to say that this is a card that I saw and was like, well, that's a card I'm never going to put in any of my cubes. Like, it's just enough new novel stuff, a huge block of text for people to read. I was like, it's probably not going to, that's not going to clear the bar for me for any of my cube environments. But I did, after some thought, end up putting it in 100 Ornithopters because card advantage is so important there. I was looking for more colorless sources of card advantage that also were not just card advantage, could also be win conditions, because both card advantage and win conditions are really important in that cube to have it at a certain density. And so any card that can do both, I pay extra attention to. And I think in that cube, I have learned that I have more tolerance for foolishness, for nonsense, than I do in my average cube. I think partially because that's kind of the vibes. The cube has kind of a silly, over-the-top vibe, so having a card that is over-the-top and requires a lot of reading is not so out of place. I also think partially because there's 100 duplicates of an extremely simple card, which means that there's just less reading to do in any pack because you got 4 to 6 Ornithopters in your pack, so you can take a second to read the Aetherspark if you've never seen it before. And we played a draft with this, and my sort of metric, which I gave to the other people in my sort of thread, we're talking about designing this cube, people that have clones of this cube, I was like, I think this card's actually okay, because Anthony drafted it and played with it, and he didn't really groan about it. There was very little grumbling and sort of moaning about having to play this card.
Oh, God, I hate this new benchmark that I'm becoming a part of.
It's not new, buddy. You've been this for a while. Oh. So the fact that you played with this and weren't like, ugh, this card's real, was a good sign to me.
To be clear, I think this card is extremely powerful, and I think that my deck was just not particularly set up to really take advantage of it, and
I wasn't implying you would grumble at the power. I was implying you would grumble at being forced to read it and interact with complex card designs.
I mean, I think it is pretty novel. Like, the thing that I like about this card is that the complexity isn't just doing more for the sake of doing more. Like, the mechanics actually function together, and it is like a novel recombination and novel way of implementing an equipment planeswalker.
They should have made it an air freshener.
That would have been more appropriate for the flavor.
Or maybe a keychain, a little jangly keychain.
Yes, absolutely. It kind of is
Fuzzy
just
dice.
a keychain, to be honest. Like, what is it?
It looks like
It looks like a keychain. It is
a very big keychain, sure.
Looks like an exhaust manifold. No, I'm kidding. It can't be attacked as long as it's attached. That's crazy.
Like, you gonna attack my sword? That's ridiculous.
Well,
Or my keychain?
fair enough. It also just like means that the entire card is balanced around it having the artifact type line and therefore being vulnerable to all of the artifact hate and removal and like spot removal and so on. You know, it's like Wizards prints a card to deal with Arcbound Ravager and Aetherspark gets hit with collateral damage. So it's just really interesting that the normal way that a Planeswalker is removed from play is taken away from this card, and instead you counterplay this by killing an artifact.
Yeah,
like
honestly, it is so barely a Planeswalker. Like, it's kind of crazy they made it fit that mold instead of it just being an equipment.
Is this just Umezawa's Jite? It's basically that.
It's Umezawa's keychain.
Umezawa's keychain.
Anyway, the lesson there for me is at least that, even if a card seems to be really not fitting any of my goals at first blush, every cube is different, and, anything that seems like a hard rule to you, you might find a place where it makes sense to make an adjustment, because after playing it in a draft or two, I feel like it's probably going to stick around in that cube for the duration, for the foreseeable future, because it does fit the mechanics very well. You can cheat it in with Sigarda's Aid, which is pretty sick, and like you said, Parker, I think this card might be a problem there, except that it is limited by the fact that you can just destroy an artifact, which the first couple of times I saw people do it, they were like, can I just destroy that? Like, it's got all these counters on it. It's this big, like, legendary thing. It's like, yeah, you can just shatter it. 1 red mana is gone. You broke your keychain. Whatever.
Yeah, it's crazy. All right. That was Aetherdrift.
That's Aetherdrift. Do we want, at the end of the episode here, to have any little discussion about the aesthetics of the set, or we just not want to touch on it, other than the bobblehead?
I want to mention that actually the Wandering Emperor has no Planeswalker subtype. And so
that's a great point, yeah.
If you've already sent your correction comment, you got baited for engagement.
Baby.
I don't need to talk about the aesthetics.
Great. Then we won't.
I could instead tell you about Cube for a Cause.
Do it. I want to hear all about it.
So last weekend, I was in, or I guess 2 weekends ago, I was in Brooklyn, New York for Cube for a Cause, hosted by Scott Mertz and benefiting the trans advocacy group Glitz. And so we played a lot of Cube Draft, and I came in 13th overall on the weekend, but then I realized this is a Cube event where every trophy gives you an extra match point. And if it hadn't been that way, I would have been in the top 8, I think, because my match win rate
you were
was
just 2-1 all weekend?
I won 2/3 of my matches over the weekend, and the people I played against were quite skilled as well. I mostly only lost to people higher than me in the rankings, and so my tiebreakers were really good. I'm not at all bummed that I missed top 8 because, I played as well as I could control, and I couldn't control how the judges allocated points. So I thought it was a lot of fun. And then I also had a couple of design and gameplay level up moments, which I wanted to share.
Well, hit us with some of those.
So the first draft of the weekend, I was drafting Gwen Decker's Loam Cube. This was not a cube I had gone into the weekend necessarily hoping to draft. It is a cube where every player begins the game with Life from the Loam in their graveyard. It was just a lot of thinking, and I didn't necessarily want to do that Saturday morning, but they needed somebody to move from my pod of 7 to that pod of 7, the Loam pod, to kind of make the numbers even. And so, I volunteered out of the drafters I was sitting with. That was an interesting draft. I ended up drafting kind of a green, black, red aggro deck that involved Dredging, Forgotten Amalgam, and Poxwalkers and other kind of self-recursive creatures into my graveyard, and then bringing them all back at once and kind of attacking almost the classic creature dredge play pattern. And one of the things that I had wanted to work on for the weekend was making better mulligan decisions. One of my leaks as a player, which I realized in Vertex, was that when I think my deck is good, I mulligan worse because I believe that my deck will like bail out my bad draws. Like,
So you're saying you don't mulligan when you should because you're like, well, my deck is great. I can only draw good cards from here.
right, exactly. That's exactly the fallacy that goes on. And so instead, I rip 3 lands in a row and have no spells to play for the first 3 turns, and I just die. And then I kind of lock it in and I like give myself a little pep talk and I start playing better, but I'm already one game down, and it doesn't take much bad luck from there to lose the match. So I was kind of like telling myself with every mulligan, like, is this a good hand on its own merits? Don't think about the rest of your deck. Or like, don't trust your deck would be a better way to say it. And I think I did fairly well in that. I ended up losing to the Cube's creator in the finals of that draft, which also taught me, when you're drafting a context shift cube against the person who made it, and the other 6 people at the table also haven't drafted this cube ever, you're fighting uphill. I don't know. One of the things about context shifts is that it so rewards prior experience. So no bad beats or anything. It was just, I didn't know what was good. And so I kind of lost that draft before we even started deck building. It's like good gameplay can only take you so far when every card has been recontextualized. So that was draft 1. I went 2-1, lost in the finals. Then I played a mono red cube by our mutual friend Nick. And I, again, kind of a context shift cube because you have no other colors. And that means that red removal, which is normally really good when it's supplemented with black removal so that you can kill big creatures and your red removal kills the small stuff, that no longer worked. That heuristic no longer worked. You had to use lightning bolt to kill the small stuff and like chaos warp effects to kill the big stuff. And that's a really different gameplay experience. And so I went into the cube seeing a bunch of big dragons, Utvara Hellkite, like an 8-mana dragon, Bogarden Hellkite, another 8-mana dragon, these really big dreams to live. And I was like, I'm not touching those with a 9-foot pole. That was my initial draft heuristic headed in.
Okay.
I wanted to go under those, and I wanted threats that didn't have downside risk if my opponent was trying to out-aggro me in the red cube. And that got me to the finals on pretty much that philosophy. I got to play against Patrick in round 2, and we had a good match, but I think he flooded out in 1 game. And then in the finals, I was playing against someone named Gabe from the Brooklyn scene, really nice person. And they go turn 3 Seething Song into Demanding Dragon, which is a 5-mana 5/5 flyer. Just turn 3 5/5, and then kill me in 4 turns, like over 4 attacks. That was more or less the only deciding play of that game.
I mean, making a big dragon is pretty cool.
Dragons are OP.
It was very cool, very stylish, and from that I learned, even if I have a strong hypothesis heading into a draft, I don't think my hypothesis was necessarily wrong, but I should have been open in the draft to kind of leaning into the conceit of the cube a little more, and I might have seen that was a play pattern that I needed to know how to either build myself or play against. So it was really fun to play that match and be pleasantly surprised by a 5-mana dragon doing the thing. And then Gabe told me it was their first ever cube trophy. And so it was fun to watch that and be present for that. And then, so third draft of the weekend, I played the idealized Ravnik cube. And this was where it was kind of make or break for me. I was a trophy away from, I think, being in the top 8. But I was at a pod with Dan Schneider and Zach Barish and several other
Sharks.
Several other sharks.
Sharks in the
water. I'm
water.
not naming everybody, and I'm sorry if I forgot you. I know Max or Finite MTG was also in the pod, a very skilled Magic player. And so, I was sweating a little bit. My goal was not to lose the draft, to stay open and find the open lane. And this is a really interesting Ravnica cube by Jen the Judge, very thoughtfully designed. I found myself drafting pick 1 blue card into pick 2, a green card, and then an Is It Fixing Land, and then a Boros card. And even though I hadn't picked much red, I realized, one of my core colors is red. because if I'm Izzet, I can play this fixing land and I can splash the Boros card that I've already picked, or I can be Gruul and I can splash blue and play this green card that I've already picked. So it's just this really interesting like dynamic in draft where I didn't have many red cards in my pool, but it happened to be the link that tied all of my prior picks together into a deck. So it was really interesting to navigate that draft. And then I got past a Hydroid Krasis and I was like, oh, I'm clearly going to be either Gruul or Izzet splashing my third color. And that's how it continued to go. I ended up Simic with a heavy red splash. I think I had the best mana fixing at the table, and I was certainly in an open lane. And so I was proud of myself for navigating that draft with those very skilled opponents. And then I found myself up against Zach Barish in round 2. I have never beaten Zach, I think. I don't know if y'all have.
I don't think so.
I beat him once, apparently, because last time he was here, I was like, I've never beaten you. And he's like, no, you beat me this one time, and here's exactly how you did it. And I'm like, oh, glad you remember the whole game. Cool, great.
Yeah. So, I love playing against Zach, however, because he's an extremely pleasant opponent and so good at Magic, and I feel like I can go all out and I won't get scammed in any way. Like, I can think through some lines. Actually, I'd asked him to look through my deck during the deck build portion, and he was like, I'm going to cut out all of that information from my brain. I won't use it against you. The fact that I've seen your deck and you haven't seen mine. So, an extremely honorable duelist, and that makes it a lot of fun to play with him. But he was on a Boros aggro deck.
I knew it was Boros aggro. That's my favorite thing to play in that cube.
Oh, yeah. It was a sweet deck. I don't think it was open at my seat, but it was open in his. And so he had quite a good version of this deck. His fixing was not good, I think, but he had a War Leader's Call and a couple of busted commander cards. So I was hoping to draw my Hydroid Krasis and to draw my Deadbridge Goliath and in other words, my huge blockers and my huge life-gaining like 4/4s that are out of range of his removal, out of range of his creatures.
And you were hoping he drew plains and red cards.
Right. And so I beat him in game 1 using more or less that plan. My Sylvan Caryatid is a 2/5 blocker that replaced itself on ETB, and it blocks like 14 points of damage. My Hydroid Krasis keeps me alive. I'm able to follow that up with a couple of other 3-drops. And so I actually take game 1. I'm able to, turn the corner and win with my big flyers. So game 2, I'm on the draw. And I just get run over. I think not much of interest happened except that a crazy commander card killed me, kind of soloed the game. Game 3, I'm on the play. I'm out to a good start, but I'm being beaten down by flyers in the air, and they're boosted by War Leader's Call so that they're bigger than usual. And I draw this card called Intrude on the Mind. And I want to read this rules text real quick. Intrude on the Mind is a 3 blue instant. Reveal the top 5 cards of your library and separate them into 2 piles. So it's kind of a fact or fiction, but the person who casts it does the split. An opponent chooses one of those piles. Put that pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. And then it says, create a 0/0 colorless Thopter with flying, then put a counter on it for each card put into your graveyard this way. So it's got this extra couple of wrinkles relative to fact or fiction, right? You do the splitting, and also whatever pile gets put into your graveyard, you get an equally sized flyer. And I resolve this card at Zach's during combat. As a 3/3 flyer, a couple of 3/3 flyers are coming at me in the air. And I reveal a pile that includes one of the best cards in my deck, Ruination Worm. This is a big worm that blocks like a champ, and an ETB fights a thing, and it would have totally stabilized me all by itself. And I start tanking over how to split these piles. And I'm like, do I go a 4-1 split so that I can either get the worm that will stabilize me, or I can get 4 cards, and maybe that will incentivize Zach to give me the worm instead, which is the card I really want.
You must be thinking of a different worm for what it's worth. Ruination Worm is just a vanilla 7/6.
Oh, you're so right.
Is it so Ravager funny. Worm?
Ravager Worm. There we go.
All right, cool.
I love Ruination Worm, though. Shout out to my boy.
Just wanted to get that on record before the comments come rolling in.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm tanking over the split, and I end up splitting the Ravager Worm by itself and the other 4 cards in their pile. And Zach tells me to pick the 4 cards and make a 1/1 Thopter because I've put 1 card into my graveyard. And that Thopter was not nearly big enough to block the 3/3 flyers, so I have to take a couple more turns of damage, and then Zach makes an Alpha Strike, and I block, and I get totally blown out by a heroic charge kind of effect that pumps the entire team. If I hadn't made the exact blocks that Plague Wind did me, then I would have just been dead. So, I continued to play well, but then after the game, I realized I lost the whole thing when I didn't make a 5-0 split with my Factor Fiction pile. A 5-0 split would have given me either the best card in my deck or a 5/5 flyer that would have blocked and killed a creature in combat and then continued to be the biggest thing on the board.
It's kind of cool that that's a card that.
But because that was so outside the
meme.
Factor Fiction heuristic that I was used to, I didn't stop to think through that enough. Or I didn't, honestly, it never even occurred to me. And so I thought it was really interesting to lose a game, not because I was making bad decisions, but because I was making decisions that didn't apply to the card that was actually being played in that moment.
Yeah, it's really funny that that's a situation
I did lose, and that kicked me out of contention for the top 8 in this tournament, but I lost to a really skilled opponent, and I learned something about making new decisions along the way. So I really enjoyed the weekend, had a great time, plan to go again in August.
Yeah, it's really interesting that is a situation where the 5-0 split mechanically, from a game design perspective, makes sense.
You're also there.
You can't hear us talking at all?
I don't think so.
How'd that happen?
Have I lost audio?
Hello? You must have unplugged your headphones. Our audio's fine. Parker.
All right. I got it. I don't know what happened.
You can hear us now?
I can hear you now.
Damn, I thought you were just full on big dogging us because we tried to interject a couple times and you just kept plowing through, and I was like, respect, this is great. This will mean that make a really clear edit. I don't have to worry about cutting out, weird interjections. No, I was going to say that I think it's a really cool that card makes the 5-0 split a legitimate option, because I'm familiar with the 5-0 split on Factor Fiction when you're just dunking on your opponent. When they resolve Factor Fiction and you're like, yeah, have all 5, it doesn't matter, I'm still killing you. That is a cool move with the Factor Fiction. And I probably also would have not realized that was a legitimate option here from a game design perspective. But the fact that, you maybe I should have identified those 4 cards are irrelevant. All that matters here is Ravager Worm or a 5/5, and so where you put those other cards doesn't matter. It's not going to affect Zach's decision. He's going to have to give you one or the other. Kind of crazy. Cool line. Yeah,
it was really cool. And one of the best ways to get knocked out of contention for top 8 that I could have imagined, because it wasn't Mana Screw. It wasn't a non-game where I got run over. It wasn't, that I had made any dumb mistakes. I was making a mistake that I had never made before. And it's very rare that Magic has such a tight feedback loop between decisions and outcome.
Sick. Great story.
Yeah, congrats on your great performance as well.
Good tournament report.
Thanks.
Yeah, for those that don't know, Cube for a Cause happens twice a year, every August and every February. I remember around those times, I think. So I think I plan to be at the one in August. I couldn't make the one this time around, but love a good Scotty Mertz event. Well, Parker, you'll be back very soon, I think, to discuss the book Playing Oppression. I'm not sure how soon, but soon enough. We're recording this kind of well in advance because next week is Saltbox, which means that I'm going to drop Bearish Files 4. So this will come out a week after that. So the time is all an illusion right now. But we'll talk to you soon for the next episode, Parker.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Looking forward to Saltbox. And yeah.
Yeah, can't wait to see you this weekend. What time is your train get in? I'll cut this out, obviously.
I think I get in at 1, and then Patrick's trying to get me to see a new movie with him, so we might watch a movie that evening.
Cool.
But I don't have tons of plans otherwise.
Sweet. I think we're going to help Max set up a little bit at the venue, so you're welcome to join us for that, or you can go hang out with Patrick. That also works.
Okay. When's the setup happening?
5 p.m., I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. See you this weekend.
Cool.
I'm excited.
And that is the conclusion of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Let us know in the comments if you thought this one episode for the entire set made sense, or if you missed the old 2 or 3 episode model. And of course, if we got any cards wrong during this episode and you leave a comment about it, you got baited for engagement. Don't be a sucker. You're better than that. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by thinking really hard about Magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. Parker and Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you for the gift of talking about cars, my favorite subject.
Thank you for being the Mad Max to my Furiosa, or vice versa.
I want to be the blood bag.
You can be the blood bag. Does that make Anthony all of the wives? Question mark or Nux? I guess Nux.
Anthony?
I haven't seen the new one, so I think I'm missing some
you haven't seen
context.
Fury Road?
Sorry.
Whoa.
We can fix that
Fury
this
Road was
weekend.
the one that came out like a couple years ago, right?
Like probably 8 years ago at this point.
Yeah.
2015.
Well,
yeah.
maybe it's just replaced my brain with other things.
Okay, well you should maybe go
we can watch it together.
Okay.
just in case.
I
There's
own
actually
it.
there's a have you ever seen the black and white one, Parker?
Oh, it's so cool.
That one's very cool. Apparently the director, Anthony, for your benefit, wanted to shoot it in black and white and could not get the movie studios to agree to let him to do it. But they did remaster it. Like the director oversaw the remastering, so it's not just like they put it through a grayscale filter. Like they, rebalanced the sort of brightness of all the scenes and stuff, and there's a black and white director's cut out there that is pretty sick.
Cool.
I love a black and white remaster. Godzilla -1 had a -1 color edition, and that was the one I saw first. It was incredible. Yeah.
Sick. I've never heard of that.
Oh, it's the best Godzilla movie. We can watch that together too. We don't have to cube. We could just watch movies all weekend.
Somewhere in the sort of distance, Patrick's force senses are tingling. His midi-chlorians are going crazy at the thought of just watching movies all weekend and not even playing Magic.